Our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Bailey, for whom Assembly Member Prince is attending as a substitute, Assembly Member Duval, for whom Assembly Member McCartney is attending as a substitute, Assembly Member Rogers, for whom Assembly Member Garrett is attending as a substitute, and we also are joined by the following members virtually: Assembly Member Ahmad, Assembly Member Moema, Assembly Member Pigeon, and Assembly Member McCartney.
Lovely, thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Noted. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the chairing arrangements for the committee as agreed at the Mayor's Question Time meeting on the 16th of December 2021? Noted. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of December 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the completed ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. Can we note the recent action taken by me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's letter to the Secretary of State for Justice? Can we note the Mayor's response received to the Violent Crime Part 1 report? Lovely, thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer session with guests on hate crime in London. So I'd like to welcome our guests, Kenny Bowie, Director of Strategy and NPS Oversight at MOPAC, Assistant Chief Constable Charlie Doyle, British Transport Police, Barry Hughes, Chief Crown Prosecutor, London North Crown Prosecution Service, and Dr. Dave Rich, Director of Policy, Community Security Trust. You gentlemen are all here. Thank you very much. And our virtual guests, Commander Melanie Dales, Metropolitan Police Service, Dr. Matteo Vagani from Tackling Hate, Louise Holden, Hate Crime Partnership Project Manager, Inclusion London, and Jennifer Taylor from Breaking Out the Bubble. So thank you all for attending today. I'm going to start the questions because we're so very lucky today to have quite a few guests. I shall direct these to start with at the Metropolitan Police Service. So if I can ask you, Melanie Dales, how have hate crimes in London evolved over the past few years, and how big a priority is preventing and tackling hate crime for the Met?
So over the last 12 months specifically, there's been a I've been in post for 20 months now, and when I came into post, there was considerable concern from the partners across London about the effectiveness of this strategic approach. So we have developed a new strategic meeting, which has got senior leaders from Gallup. We've got the CEO from Gallup there, the Director of Telmama, Director of Policy at CST, the CEO of Victim Support, the CEO of Stormwall, Home Office. All of those individuals are represented at the meeting. And the strategic objectives of the meeting are to improve that partnership working and provide that joint strategic oversight in response to hate crime, and to identify the issues, increase reporting, and to make sure that referrals are made taking into account the circumstances the victim needs. And also then to move on to CPS and maximise the positive relationship with them, and then to reassure and increase confidence. So the board has been working closely to develop a new governance structure, which is supported by the IAGs and working groups, to support the strategic aims of that meeting. And that has been supported by a new problem profile across London, which has enabled us to really focus on the issues at hand and specifically understand the majority of crimes that are committed by very few people, and the majority of victims are actually re-victimised. So we've been focusing our efforts very much on those, and that links to some of the recommendations that have been made in the reports that I know the board has seen. So from my perspective, it is one of my areas that I lead on. It is very high priority. I chair the board. I've taken a personal interest in it. The board is bi-monthly in order for us to get some traction. And we are starting now to work with partners to redevelop and re-engage and ensure that we do give a much more enhanced service for victims of hate crime.
Okay, I mean, recall it's a big priority in preventing and tackling hate crime for the Met?
I think that the board's view, and one of our strategic aims, was to increase reporting. We acknowledge across the board that one of our key priorities has been to work with the communities to increase that reporting, to make sure that we do know and do understand what's going on. And that's been really crucial in understanding the problem profile, so we understand the issues across London with the data that we can then use. So I don't see that clearly the issue of hate crime and anybody being an offence of hate crime is an issue, but the fact that more people are reporting it, I'm actually quite encouraged by.
Okay, that's good. I'm going to bring given that we've got so many wonderful statues in London, I'm concerned because the recent trial in Bristol, as you will be aware, and I'm quoting from the Daily Mail here from today, throughout the trial, the protesters did not disagree that they were the ones who orchestrated the demise of the statue, but argued that their actions were accounted for because the statue itself had been a hate crime against the people of Bristol. Now, personally, I wouldn't like to see that nonsense occur here. We've got such wonderful statues. What is your view, or what is the Met's view of this, given that they are going to have to protect the wonderful statues in London?
Well, that would come, under criminal damage under the legislation of there, and certainly we're not. Our job is to protect property, and there's certainly no offence or no criminal legislation which talks about statues being racist or hateful in any way, and therefore our job is to protect that property in the way it would be anybody's home or anybody else's property.
Well, splendid. Of hate crime, but perhaps for others have got other views. I'm always happy to hear other views. The next question, to what factors do you attribute the rise in hate crimes in London, and what impact have COVID restrictions had on the levels of hate crime? Would any of the other members from the police or MOPAC like to comment on that before I go to our other guests?
Chair, thank you. Charlie Dalbridge, Transport Police. I think from a transport network perspective in London, all crime, not just hate crime, is undoubtedly tied to footfall. And as you might expect, throughout the pandemic, we have seen a steady decline in the number of passenger journeys. Ordinarily, in any given year, we have circa 5 million passenger journeys a day coming in and out of London, and thousands of train movements. That has been significantly diminished as a consequence of COVID, particularly the usage. And as a consequence, we've seen a decline in hate crime reported. We're not complacent to that fact, because we do realise that every crime has a serious impact on the victims concerned. So I think we expect to see a reduction, as we see a reduction in footfall on the network. But up until that point, we'd had a pretty steady picture around hate crime reported on the network, and have put a number of measures in place to address that. As Mel has sort of outlined, that included a number of operations with significant partners in this space to largely, I guess, improve our understanding and response, crucially, and particularly focus on the care of victims when they have been exposed to such heinous crimes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Can I ask Louise Holden from the Hate Crime Partnership? She's virtual. Louise?
Hello, good morning.
Hi, Louise.
Morning. Yes, so because of and especially in the response to the poor police response report that we published in November 2021. Thank you for taking the time to read it, for giving us the opportunity to provide evidence today. And we also wanted to thank the London Mayor for continuing to prioritise hate crime when there are just so many pressing priorities, especially at this time. Because of time questions that were sent with the invitation, but I just thought I'd take this opportunity to go through what we feel are the important factors to understanding the barriers for disabled people to report. And it's really important to work with disabled people to develop the solutions. And thank you for inviting Jennifer Taylor, who is one of the Breaking Up the Bubble team, which is an organisation run by and for people with learning difficulties. And they're part of the London DDPO Hate Crime Partnership, which Inclusion London leads on. DDPO stands for Deaf and Disabled People's Organisation. So we're led by for disabled people and deaf people.
Okay, we obviously will be talking to Jennifer and thrilled that she's come as well. But I mean, could you just name a couple of factors that you think attribute to the rise in hate crimes? And do you think that COVID has restricted some of these crimes?
Well, we conducted a survey in the first lockdown of our members. I was really surprised that the hate crime incidents and crimes had increased. And the factors that were specific to COVID were focusing on disabled children being targeted because they were at home more.
Right, okay, well that's dreadful in itself, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned Jennifer. Jennifer's actually on screen for us. Do you have any idea, Jennifer, what factors you attribute to the rise in hate crimes in London?
The crimes are going up now with people with learning difficulties, and they seem to, for people with learning difficulties, and we get bullied and get called names out on the street sometimes.
That's not good enough, is it? Tell me,
No.
Jennifer, has this got worse during COVID, or do you think it, because there are less people around, it's any better? What do you think?
I think that I've seen a lot of hate crime in my time, in the past, and people with learning difficulties get bullied out, get spat out, because we just gone about our daily business with people with learning difficulties, and I've seen it so many times, hate crime, and it's been on the news, it's been on the radio, because I watch a lot of news on my TV, and I see it so many times happen to people with learning difficulties. I don't know why this is going on.
Jennifer, it's Louise here. I know that Vic asked me to support you at the meeting.
Yeah.
And I know that since COVID, a lot of the people that you've been supporting, they've been affected by being targeted online, haven't they?
Yeah,
Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, they've been targeted online and on the internet, and also on the computer sometimes when they're trying to find new relationships or things like that, and because this is all happening before the COVID, this is not on, because we get bullied all the time with people with learning difficulties across the country, because it's not really on.
No,
And we are people with learning difficulties,
That's right. No, you're quite right. It isn't on at all. I'll go to another question on this. Data shows that there are trends to be a spike in some categories of hate crime in summer months. For example, homophobic and racist and religious hate crimes. What can be done to counter this trend? And if I go this time to Kenny Bowie from MOPAC, please.
Thanks. So I think the first thing to say is that if you look at the ONS statistics, which I think are from 2021, it attributes most of the rise in police recorded hate crime actually to better identification of what constitutes a hate crime and better, more willingness of people to come forward, which is in itself probably a good thing. In terms of how to actually deal with spikes or rises, I don't think it matters whether, if you look at what happened with anti-Semitic abuse following the Gaza demonstrations earlier this year, or what happens to anti-Muslim abuse during Ramadan when they're more visible, or during the summer months. You see, I think one of the things that can be done is education, both within schools and in terms of community groups, and that's why the Mayor supports various community groups, either through the money which is given to councils or through the Shared Endeavour Fund. The other way that we can do this is by for example, some of the campaigns which is led, you'll see that on the transport network, where you'll see the campaigns actively against hate. The other ways that can be done this is some of the work which is being done by the Metropolitan Police, for example, with and MOPAC through the new stakeholder reference group, to bring together people in order that we can actually have conversations about the best way of tackling exactly these sort of spikes. And again, within the Metropolitan Police, you have new hate crime liaison officers within every BCU who will be able to reach out and bring people together to identify and tackle any local spikes. So I think those are some of the ways in which it can be done.
Apologies, my microphone died then. Can I also ask Dr. Matteo Vagani, he's virtual as well, ask him his views on that?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Look, I'm sorry, I'm not able to use my camera at the moment.
Okay.
Yes, because I have a very unstable connection. I should have been in a different place, but because of COVID, yes, I'm stuck somewhere else. Anyway, yeah, look, as you may know, I am based in Melbourne, Australia, so this is where my work focuses on. I can say that certainly based on very recent research we have conducted, the areas of Australia where there was a strictest lockdown and the longest lockdown, and generally COVID-related policies, well, actually saw the highest increase in hate crimes against a range of communities, specifically the Asian community and the Jewish community. So we think that there is a relationship between, maybe not direct, mediated by some factors such as ideology linked to anti-lockdown groups, but there is a relationship between COVID and COVID management policies and the increase in hate crime.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Dave Rich from the CST?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me this morning. The patterns of COVID restrictions definitely had an influence on the anti-Semitic hate crimes and hate incidents reported to CST, and also on the methods of those hate crimes. We've seen over the last 2 years a pattern of a new type of hate crime of Zoom bombing or Zoom raiding, where people get the login details of Jewish community events, Jewish religious services and educational events that are online, and enter those events on Zoom or Teams or another online platform and shout abuse, put anti-Semitic comments in the chat and so on. And that's something we've seen developing over the last 2 years, which is a completely new method of hate crime. We also, the big spike in anti-Semitic incidents last year was in May during the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And that is a pattern we've seen in previous years, but I don't think it's a coincidence that May is when COVID restrictions were starting to be lifted. And I think that had an element of release, emotional release, which meant some of those hate crimes were perhaps more extreme, more nasty. Certainly the demonstrations we saw were bigger and more angry than they might have been, because people were getting out for the first time and it was an opportunity to really let off steam.
Yes, we all saw those, and they were appalling. I mean, while I've got you on the mic, as it were, one of my questions is that there's been a recent report of anti-Semitic attacks involving young children, with a big spike in reported anti-Semitic hate crimes, as you've just mentioned in the summer. Do you understand the drivers behind the increase, particularly on this recent, with the young children being involved, and what action is actually being taken to tackle that?
We've definitely seen an increase in incidents in schools targeting Jewish children, but also targeting Jewish teachers, and that was also something that happened in May during the conflict, and we've seen it in universities as well. A lot of that is online, but a lot of it is driven by online activity, but the actual incidents are happening offline, in person. And I think obviously where young children and schools are involved, and education is absolutely key. CST has a program called Stand Up, which goes into schools, which has been supported by MOPAC in the past, which educates about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate crime with young Jewish and Muslim educators. And that's something that we've offered to several different schools following incidents, and it's normally had a positive impact.
Yes, I mean, I believe one of my colleagues in another place was told to take their children's blazers off at school before they came out of school, so they couldn't be recognised, which I find unbelievable. But what feedback are you actually getting from the Jewish community in London? Do they feel more unsafe than they have done before?
I think the impact of the rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes last year has definitely left a legacy of feelings of insecurity in the Jewish community. It wasn't just during the conflict in May. During the recent festival of Hanukkah in November, there were a series of quite high-profile incidents, because it's a period when the Jewish community is very visible again. There was one on Oxford Street, which got a lot of publicity. There was a very serious assault in West Hampstead as well. The police have issued witness appeals and put out images of the alleged offenders, but as far as I'm aware, there's been no arrests. And of course, when you get high-profile incidents like that, the best way to really strengthen community confidence is for there to be arrests and prosecutions, and that's something that where I think the focus really needs to be in order to just reinforce that confidence in the Jewish community.
Well, absolutely. And on that point, then, can I come to Barry Hughes from the CPS? Do you have a comment on that?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me as well. The first point I'd make is this, that all hate crimes charged by the police have to be referred to the CPS for authority to charge. That means it inevitably takes time for an offence to be investigated and then passed through to the CPS to charge. So that's a roundabout way of me saying that the CPS sees these offences rather later than they happen in real time. And there's a process whereby they have to be passed through to the CPS. We make a charging decision, we then put them in court, and then if the defendant pleads guilty, we may secure an early guilty plea. But if people plead not guilty, we are seeing some very big delays in the Crown Courts, which I know this committee is aware of because I saw your letter to the Lord Chancellor.
Yes.
And this means that some cases, and all hate crimes are serious, but we have so many offences in the Crown Court at the moment that there is, in very simple terms, an enormously long queue. And the less serious cases are going to the end of that queue. So we are seeing a pandemic-driven change to the way in which cases reach court and find their way through to a jury trial. So the police see the offences as they happen, the CPS see them rather later in the day. And so our response is driven by the police response. We're entirely dependent upon cases coming through to the CPS, and then we're dependent upon the courts having the capacity to have cases listed for plea and then for trial. So it's the pandemic has driven a different set of dynamics, and that is so in London, as I know this committee is aware, more than anywhere else. because of the pre-existing backlogs and then the impact of the pandemic upon the courts. So we do see things later than they happen in real time. But we also in the CPS look at all the different strands of hate crime. So we can see that there are some types of hate crime where there has been, despite the time slippage, there has been an increase. So racist and religious offending, for example, we have seen an increase. Other types of hate crime have stayed relatively stable. So, for example, homophobic hate crime, disability hate crime, which is at a very low level in London anyway. And then there's been a decrease in our prosecutions for crimes against older people as well. So it's probably not right to treat all hate crime the same, because there are different strands, and we, in effect, put them all into the same pot and call them hate crime. There has been an increase over recent months, and that is an improvement from a decrease at the end of last calendar year and financial year. So we see the changes more slowly than they happen in real time, because they have to work their way through the system. But it is right to say that over the last 2 quarters of 21-22, there has been an increase in the cases coming through to us from the police. But that then has to see itself mirrored in our putting the cases into court and having them heard. So there is a significant time slippage. I hope that's clear.
Yes, I'm really grateful that you've come and explain that, because so many times people think that justice isn't done, the police get the blame for that, when actually the police have put it into the system. And I'm very pleased you've read the letter, because we have got a massive problem in London and it's got to be resolved, and some of us will be taking that up further and higher, because everything gets locked in such an untimely way, and it just looks like justice isn't being done, which isn't good for anybody, let alone our democracy. Thank you for that. Just one quick question now from me. Really, I think this has to go to Commander Dales. In 2019, this committee heard some concerns that the Met's recording of hate crimes can be inconsistent. So do you agree, and what action has the Met taken to improve the recording of hate crimes in London? So
since that date, there's been a huge amount of work done in relation to training of the officers and the instalment of the hate crime officers, which has been spoken about already, which each exist on each of the BCUs. In addition to that, we've just launched, within the last 8 months, a new electronic form. And what this does is it standardises the ability for officers to both identify hate crime, to categorise it correctly, and to make sure that the victims of the hate crime are referred on to in the main catch as its support agency. So it's also been embedded within our probationer training to standardise it, and it's an ongoing training function of the locally based hate crime officers.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to now bring in Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the panel. Chair, I have a couple of questions on homophobic hate crime, which has seen a dramatic rise in the last 10 years. In fact, June 2021, as I understand things, represented the highest single month of homophobic hate crime in the last 10 years. So the first of my 2 questions is to the Met and MOPAC. Unfortunately, Gallup aren't here, but maybe through officers we can write to them to get a response. To Commander Dale, first, the findings of the Stephen Port inquiry have shocked everyone. And you will no doubt will have either seen or be aware of the 3-part BBC drama that concluded last night, 4 Lives, which I think, I'm sure I speak for everyone here, was very, very moving, to say the least. And this will have had a particular impact on London's LGBT communities and the trust they have in the police to deal with crimes against LGBT Londoners properly. What work is now being undertaken to reassure and build trust so we don't see a drop in the reporting of hate crimes and other incidents from London's LGBT communities, and what more needs to be done?
So there's been a huge amount of work done since the very beginning, and starting off from the operational activity, there was a review in relation to how the major crime unit worked with the local BCUs in order to identify and deal with issues, and to ensure that issues such as chemicals and drugs were identified at a very early stage in relation to a technique for murder. That has also been built into the training courses and is now embedded in our senior investigating officer training. The policies and procedures have been trained in relation to the identification, and a huge amount of work was done into what we call the golden hour principle, where officers attend the scene and also to make sure that they identify all lines of inquiry. There's been a review of how we manage our family liaison support to victims of hate crime to ensure that the service that they get is much more enhanced than what it previously was. And I think that whilst I haven't been directly involved in this inquiry, I know there's been a huge amount of apology already from the Metropolitan Police and a wide acceptance that we could have and should have done better and are striving to do so in the future. I think the work that I'm doing with the strategic board now is to ensure that we are working with the IAGs through the stakeholder groups and using the contacts we have within the Metropolitan Police already to really ensure that we are seen to learn the lessons, and it's not just words that are said, but actually we actively learn the lessons. We work with the communities, and to make sure that we do prioritise these cases to ensure that when people do report to us, they get a really good quality of service, and that feedback loop is back to a strategic level to ensure that where there are blockers, that these are unblocked, so we make sure that service is a good service.
So just to follow up from your response, Commander Dill, so when you talk about working with communities, well, can you be more specific? Because there's some very, very serious issues here, and the standard answer I always seem to get from the Met is that, oh, you're working with communities. So can you elaborate? I mean, have you got regular liaison with groups like Gallup, who've been around for years and have got a great deal of expertise in these areas, Stonewall and other people?
So Gallup, Stonewall, and those groups, they sit on my strategic board at a chief exec level. But in addition to that, we've also got our engagement branch of the Metropolitan Police, and the lead there for the Meta Superintendent, Dan Ivey, is working very strongly with the groups who represent the communities that we are currently talking about. So I do at a strategic level, they're included in my strategic board, and then tactically linking through to the IAGs, they're also included there. I can't tell you the details specifically, I can only talk about my strategic work that I do, but the engagement strand under Dan Ivey and Commander Catherine Roper have done a huge amount of work in relation to engaging with the communities to make sure that we've got the support that we need to enhance things.
And one more question, Commander Dill. Stephen Port was convicted in September, in late 2016, because I recall asking the mayor in December 2016 about his response, and very understandably, he was guarded in what he had to say because the inquest had yet to commence. So when did all this training and other reforms sort of start? Because it seems to me the Met, just going historically, we wait for inquests and other tragedies, and then we sort of talk about training. So what time frame can you put on all these various sort of measures that you sort of told us about? Is this something that you just started over the last few weeks, months, or did you sort of have an assessment back in 2016 when very, very serious, glaring errors with tragic consequences, had become sort of very clear?
It started back in 2016. At the point we identified the errors, and we were working to address them from that point.
Okay. And perhaps if I could ask Mopak for your response to the same question about rebuilding trust with LGBT communities in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is, following the inquest, the outcome of the inquest, you will have seen that the Mayor has written, the Deputy Mayor has written to HMI CFRS to actually ask for an inspection to make sure that the failings which were identified at the inquest have been satisfactorily resolved around the investigations, to ensure that that community doesn't just take the Met's word, our word, for the fact that that's happened, but that the fact to ensure that there is actually independent assurance around all of the main failings, and that something like that can happen again. The second thing I would say is that in the draft police and crime plan, which is out for consultation at the moment, which I was here before you all just before Christmas to talk about, we have said that increasing trust and confidence in the Metropolitan Police amongst all of London's communities is particularly important, but that we will be monitoring that by protected characteristics so that we are able to identify and see where there are any breakdowns, and the increased public's attitudes survey will allow us to highlight whether there are any particular boroughs or any particular areas where more work needs to be done, and we intend to share all of those findings, as we do already, with the Metropolitan Police in order to help guide their work on all of this. We have also, the Deputy Mayor has also met with various groups to talk about this, engaged with various staff associations here, various community groups to talk about all of this. And clearly we also fund CATCH, which is to help for not just LGBTQ+ victims of hate crimes, but any members of hate crimes, so that they get the support and the service that they need if they have been victims of that crime. And they do not need to have reported the crime to the police for that. They can self-refer into that coalition in order that they can sort of cope and recover from what we know can be a very traumatic experience. And then CATCH can themselves, if they have the permission of the person, actually refer that crime in to the police. So there's quite a lot of work underway.
Just one more question, Chair. I suspect that this committee will come back to look at some of the findings, if not all the findings of the inquest in due course. But my other question to you, Commander Dills, and the Chair has already alluded to a spike in some categories of hate crime in summer months. So the data that I've seen has shown that every summer there's certainly recurring increase in homophobic hate crimes, and that the month of June last year was the highest monthly total for homophobic hate crimes in the last 10 years, as I already mentioned. So will you look into taking specific preventative work to counter this trend ahead of summer this year?
Yeah, we will do, and that's what's included within the issues such as the problem profile and what the strategic group will be looking to identify. So the majority of hate crime doesn't incur any level of physical violence. It is normally words and sort of actions as opposed to physical, and therefore people coming out in the summer having contact with each other allows an environment where people meet each other, and those things are increased, unfortunately. So we are looking at the intelligence and data that we've got in order to identify the key hotspot areas across London where this happens, and then work with our partners and our officers in order to ensure that we are able to prevent these cases happening and support people where they do.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, can I just take this opportunity to commend BTP for the poster campaigns that have been running across all over London about hate crime and domestic violence. I certainly think they're very effective.
Yep, I'll agree with that. Thank you. Assembly Member Moema, who's here virtually.
Thank you. Just finding my unmute button. I had a question to the police and British Transport Police and Motor really, about xenophobic hate crime and the rise of that during COVID. Many of us may not have seen that very obviously before, and obviously there is a racial dimension to some of that. So can you just tell me a little bit about what work you have done, or preventative work, to address that? Maybe if there's work around countering disinformation that's available and that's spreading online. And I just wonder if, I know that Community Securities Trust have got, long-standing experience in tackling similar but not the same sort of issues, whether there's any learnings from other organisations.
Okay, if we can ask Commander to take it to start with, and then we'll go to Kenny, and then we'll go to Dave, if that's okay.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat what I've said to you already, in the sense that we are looking to work on the hotspot areas in relation to identification where we have got the highest levels of hate crime, and we haven't specifically as a strategic group decided to break that down into the different types of faith and sort of diverse areas within hate crime. We are working strategically on identifying our top 20 victims across London who are at most risk, and wrapping around a service where they get an enhanced level of support from the police and from the partnership agencies. And likewise, we're also looking at the offenders, because we know it's a very small amount of offenders. We've got 6 offenders in London that commit a huge amount of hate crime, and they all also have mental health conditions. So from my perspective, at my level, I'm working very much in relation to ensuring that how do we identify these repeat offenders who are making people's lives a misery, and how do we make sure that we get them the support they need so they stop? On a more tactical level, my hate crime officers on the BCUs are supported by their IAGs, and they're supported by they deal with the crimes that come in, and they are reviewing them. I have what's called a lead responsible officer, who's a superintendent, who works with them every 2 weeks at a meeting to go through the specific crimes to make sure that we are firstly managing the victim care appropriately, that we're linked into the support services, and that we are investigating and prioritising the crimes, because they have got, a number of them have got a 6-month statutory time limit, which we have to adhere to. So we've been making sure that we really progress and channel through, and that will link through to my colleague from CPS who said to you they've seen more cases come through. And indeed, we are now pushing things through with that. We've set a key performance indicator of all cases must reach conclusion before 5 months. And we are really pushing towards that to make sure we're able to deal with these investigations robustly.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Bowie?
So I don't have particularly much to add to what I've said before. Clearly, when the pandemic did strike, a lot of the hate crime moved online. We saw increases across all groups, but we did particularly see xenophobic abuse increase against Asian and Southeast Asian communities. It went up as well. The Deputy Mayor has met with those groups to hear their concerns, hear what can be done. We have the shared Endeavour Fund where we look at issues around hate crime. We have set up Catch in order to provide better support for victims where it is misinformation or disinformation which is being put out there on the internet. That is an area that we have identified in the draft policing crime plan as something where we will need to have a greater focus. It is a particularly tricky issue where it happens online, because it's quite often very difficult to pinpoint where it comes from. Very often these things will move off being online and go into WhatsApp chats groups, so it's very difficult to then follow what's actually happening, who's got a hold of the information. But it's certainly something where we know that over the next few years we will need to have a greater focus and develop our understanding of the tactics being used by these groups to spread that sort of misinformation. But I think it's not just within the Metropolitan Police area that needs to happen. It's a sort of national and international issue, if I can say that.
Lovely, thank you. Mr. Rich, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. Sharing learning and expertise with other communities is very much part of CST's work. We have a dedicated project called SAFE, which holds regular webinars and seminars that does exactly this, with spreading knowledge and understanding about how to tackle hate crime, how to protect community buildings and places of worship, and other kind of relevant subjects. We've done several of these in partnership with MOPAC, and I think the next one with MOPAC is coming up later this month. But we can also arrange specific bilateral learning with specific community organisations who have a need. If there are organisations, for example, from the particular communities in London who want to have direct tailored sessions, then we can arrange that as well.
Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. Chair, maybe ask David for a bit more follow-up on that at a later date.
Certainly at a later date, happy to. We'll discuss that going forward. Thank you for that. Now moving on to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year, everybody. So I want to pick up on disability hate crime, and we heard earlier from Louise Holden and also from Jennifer Taylor, and I'm going to bring you both in after I've asked some questions to some of our other guests. But so looking at the report from Inclusion London on what's described as a poor police response, there's some really worrying examples, and earlier we were told that I think by Barry Hughes that the numbers of disability hate crimes are relatively low, but I still think we need to take these crimes very seriously, and we need to make sure that there is an appropriate response to them. Now, the Met and the CPS have been criticised for failing to tackle disability hate crime effectively. Now, do you agree with this, and what action is being taken to ensure that reports of disability hate crime are dealt with effectively? And I'd like to hear on this from Commander Dales and also from Kenny Bowie and from Barry Hughes. So, Commander Dales, do you want to go first? I think Commander Dales is online.
Sorry, I'm just putting my camera on, apologies. So this forms a big part of the work in relation to the strategic group about how do we ensure that the officers are trained, understand and identify issues of disability hate crime. There has been a 21% increase in reporting of hate crime from December 19 to November 20, and then December 20 to November 21. So as I've said already throughout the meeting, I think this is a success in relation to the work that the board and the tactical groups have been doing. In addition to that, we've gone from a sanction detection rate from 1.8% to 3.9% in 12 months. And whilst that is very low, and it is very much off our aspiration of 15% as set by the Commissioner, what it has shown is that the work that we are doing is starting to pay dividends, and we've more than doubled the detection rate in less than 12 months, which is a big achievement in terms of the volume of work that the Metropolitan Police do. And this has been really led by the work that I spoke about already with the lead responsible officer who meets with the local HCOPs every 2 weeks to review the crimes and drive forward the investigations to make sure that they are progressed in the right way.
Thank you. Would either of the other, Kenny Bowie and Barry Hughes, who wants to...
So maybe if I just come in just to build on what Commander Dales has said there, because obviously not only has the Met been looking at its governance of this, but so has MOPAC, and actually MOPAC and the Metropolitan Police together, we have our new hate crime stakeholder reference group, which was initiated in July 2021, and the idea is that by bringing both of our sets of stakeholders together in that way, everything can be more powerful in terms of ensuring that the response to hate crime is appropriate in terms of the prosecution and in terms of getting the response it needs. Part of the pack, which goes to the MOPAC and Met Oversight Board on a quarterly basis, contains all of the figures around hate crime, which is actively looked at and monitored by the Deputy Mayor and a team of officials, and the Mayor receives a weekly report on actual hate crime figures and what's going on in London, so that he's able to delve into that as and when he needs to. And I think, as Commander Dale said, when looking at this, although the numbers are relatively small, there has been a 21% increase year on year to the end of November 2021 in terms of police recorded crimes which relate, hate crimes which relate to disability, and clearly it's very important that they get the response that they deserve.
Thank you. And Barry Hughes, did you want to add anything from the CPS?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, if I could just touch upon three aspects here in relation to disability hate crime. Numbers, conviction rates and public confidence. There is a link between all of them, which I'll seek to explain. As Mel said, there has been an increase in referrals. It's heading in the right direction. All of these cases have to come through the CPS, but the numbers are still very low. We see these numbers pan-London, and we see them on a BCU by BCU basis. Pan-London, the numbers are low double figures on a quarterly basis, and I don't think that can reflect the true rate of prosecutions that we should have for disability hate crime. So there's a very high level of attrition, and the reasons for that are complicated, and we've touched upon those at various points during the course of this morning. But the numbers are heading in the right direction, and the work that Mel described before is starting to show results. So there is some cause to be have a degree of confidence that things are moving in the right direction. In terms of conviction rates, we assess the conviction rates for all the different types of hate crime Racist and religiously aggravated hate crime is the one which has the highest conviction rate. Disability hate crime has the lowest. It's still reasonable at around 72%, but it could be a little bit better. And we know that the victims of disability hate crime are going to struggle more than some others in terms of the way in which they conduct themselves and are supported when it comes to court. So I've no doubt that we, the criminal justice system, we have more to do when it comes to disability hate crime in London. My final point in relation to public confidence wraps around all of this. Dave mentioned this earlier in the meeting, and I'm absolutely in agreement with him, that one of the very best ways to drive up reporting of hate crime is to give people the confidence that those offences are going to be thoroughly investigated and prosecuted and see a result in a public forum, namely the courtroom. And then we would like to see it reported in the press, which will give people confidence. The simple reality is that the very great majority of people who are charged with hate crimes end up either pleading guilty or being convicted. But I'm not sure that perception is held by the general public. But there is much to be encouraged by in relation to the way that the criminal justice system deals with disability hate crime. It is moving in the right direction, but I accept it could move more quickly.
Thank you. That's a really useful picture from all three of you, and you know, the urgency to get those numbers going more in the right direction couldn't be stronger. Now, both the Met and the CPS have been criticised for not taking action against police officers who've been found guilty of misconduct involving disabled people. Now, you know, in the Inclusion London report, there's really worrying examples of where officers at one station had all engaged in some or all of bullying and inappropriate behaviour, perverting the course of justice through evidence deletion, racist, misogynist and discriminatory behaviour and language, violence and manipulation of vulnerable people, and the use and sharing of ableist images, commentary and language. This is really worrying. Now, what is your response to these criticisms and what action are you taking? So that would be for Commander Dales first.
Thank you. So we have a Directorate of Professional Standards who have looked at and would look at any such reports, and we are guided by the national guidelines in relation to professional standards as defined by the Code of Ethics. I can't talk to you in detail about that case because I don't know the details of it. What I can say to you is that I'm 100% confident that that procedure would have been followed by our DPS. And if there was a need to hold any officer to account under misconduct or under any of the regulations, that would have been done so. But I'm afraid I can't talk in detail about that case because I don't know the specifics of it, and it'd be wrong for me to do so.
Yes, I appreciate you can't talk about a specific case, but just in terms of response to the criticism about not taking action against officers in general found guilty of misconduct involving disabled people, do you have anything to add on that?
I wouldn't want to add anything. My gut reaction would be to that can't be the case, and without actually knowing the details of the case that's been spoken about, yeah. I wouldn't want to pass any further comment on that.
Of course. Barry Hughes, do you have anything that you can add on this?
Thank you. I'll just make this point that I don't have knowledge of the particular case that you're referring to, other than what I've seen through the media. It's not something I've handled personally, so I'm afraid I can't help you with that. But we are a demand-led organisation. We apply the Code for Crown Prosecutors, and we have to be satisfied that if there is sufficient evidence to prosecute, we go on to consider whether it's in the public interest to prosecute. And if we were presented with a case involving a police officer where those two tests were both met, we would not hesitate to prosecute. And we have shown our independence. It's the reason why the CPS was set up a long time ago now. And we will prosecute police officers and have prosecuted police officers in high-profile cases over the course of last year and moving into this year, where there is evidence of criminal behaviour and where the public interest demands it. So we will take action. We are independent and we will continue to take that action where it's appropriate to do so.
Thank you. So I now want to bring in Louise Holden from Inclusion London and also Jennifer Taylor. You've both heard what the police and the CPS and MOPAC have, how they've responded to those questions just now. And I just wonder what more you think the Met and the CPS must do to improve the response on disability hate crime.
Thank you. So, I mean, my initial response is that we welcome the hate crime strategic group, but I don't know who's representing the disabled community on that group. We have been invited to the hate crime community reference group, but not the strategic group. So we would welcome an invitation to that. I don't know of any other organisations that work London-wide around hate crime against disabled people. And we have had a close look at the police and crime draft plan. And within that, hate crime is not seen, is not identified to look at repeat victimisation. Domestic violence and sexual abuse victims are, but that's something that could be added to the final document. And just going to the conviction rate, it's really encouraging that that's increasing. However, the figures, when we looked at them in detail, there's actually an increase of violent hate crime. When we're talking about hate crime, it's not separate. A hate crime can only happen if a crime is committed and it's motivated by hatred or hostility, and then you get the uplift and the sentence. It's not a separate crime that the police are dealing with. So just make that point. And there was an increase of violent crimes that were motivated by hostility and hate. And of the 1,491 nationally that were instances of violent hate crime, 30 resulted in a charge or a summons. So the figure, and then from those, the charge or the summons, the conviction rate is high, but it's still a very low amount. So what that says to the disabled community is that we can be subjected to violent crime that's motivated by hatred about who we are, and we're not going to get a conviction. So I would say, I mean, the solutions are complex, and it's not just down to the police, it's a community response that's needed. We work very closely with the CPS and the MPS, and strategically, the work is fantastic and the commitment's there, but it's just not translating onto the ground. We were quite horrified when we surveyed our member organisations that provide frontline services. We didn't ask them, are you receiving a poor response from the police? We said, what's the response like? Absolutely shocked to find that all of the organisations that support many disabled victims of hate crime, none of them reported anything other than a completely poor response. And in the report, we have submitted the case studies of, from our organisations that detail all the particular failings that are happening for people. So what we would like is for the police to work with us and to have scrutiny panels of those cases on a regular basis. We'd like the HCOPs to get involved in Disability Hate Crime Matters, which was a highly successful initiative in 2016 that led to, I think it was 500% increase in flagged hate crimes. For some reason, there's a resistance to reinstating that. It has been reinstated for other types of crime, domestic abuse. There's DA matters.
I'm sorry. I'm getting signals from the chair that this section of questioning has gone on too long, and I did just want to let Jennifer, just as a disabled person have a word on this question. So Jennifer, do you have a brief response to what you've heard from the police?
Yeah, I think I think it could be more better, because for us people with learning difficulties, I think it should be when we go to the police station and we or make a complaint, we would like to see more police believe in us, yeah, and trust us, yeah, as people as we complain to the police. And I find that for some people with learning difficulties, they don't report it, or they don't make a complaint, and sometimes they just let the defender get away with it. So I'm saying, from my point of view, as a person with the learning difficulties and a woman with the learning difficulties, living on my own, yeah, I think it's right that the police work should do more work on us and listen to us. Yeah, but we've got to say to them, not just take it in consideration, you know.
Thank you. That's very.
Some of them don't even listen to us some of the time when we make a complaint to them, you know.
I think you've made a very clear point, which actually backs up what we heard from the CPS response about the importance of trust and confidence, and the importance of getting of people feeling that their complaints are going to be heard and believed. I'm going to hand back to the chair, because I'm very aware that I've taken too much time here.
I'm very aware. I must have a terrible stare, because everybody's always made aware of it. We are running horribly over, but it's because it's such an interesting subject and we've got such interesting guests. I'll hand over now to Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you very much. I can't see that stare from home, but I will do my best within time. I'd like to start off with the Met and MOPAC briefly. The Mayor has made a commitment that MOPAC will explore with the Met how data on hate crimes against Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities can be made publicly available in a way which is compliant with data protection legislation. I had asked the Mayor's question about this. I'm wondering what progress has been made on this.
Kenny, I don't know if you can answer this one. I'm not cited on it, I'm afraid.
Okay, Kenny.
I know that the lead in MOPAC has been having discussions with people in the Metropolitan Police about it. I can't give you an exact update, I'm afraid, Assemblymember Pigeon. So I will have to write to you to provide you with a more specific update. But I do know, because I asked earlier whether there had been discussions about it, and they said yes, but then I didn't ask for any of the specifics. So my fault. Apologies.
No, that's fine. If you could write to us. And there's also the issue, it was raised earlier, about xenophobic crime and the increase since the start of the pandemic, but there's no actual official classification or official data collected on that. Is this something MOPAC is looking at so we can accurately record that data?
So it's not, I don't think it is an area that we had been looking to break the data down at that level any further than it already was. But again, I will follow up and include back in the letter to you if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, if you could come back on that and clarify, even if you've considered it and why you've ruled it out, would be helpful. My next question is for the British Transport Police and Met. If we start with the Met, and then I want to pursue a couple of things with BTP. What I want to understand is what action you have been taking to respond to the rise in hate crime on the transport network. But if we start with the Met, please.
Probably Charlie is a better person to talk to, actually, if I'm honest with you, because most of the hate crime that occurs will either be on the buses or on the underground or the trains. Obviously, that's something I'm not cited on. I can't help you with that.
But you deal with buses. The Met deals with buses, and BTP do the underground and trains.
I'm afraid I haven't got a briefing that's appropriate to give you on that today, so I'll also have to write to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Well then, could I go to British Transport Police and have your response on that, please?
Yes, thank you. I think, as I said earlier, what we have seen over the last year, 18 months, is a reduction in hate crime on the network. We have identified a number of locations where hate crime is more prevalent. But when I say more prevalent, that's in the context of per million passenger journeys, and at the highest level, it's 3.5 crimes reported per million passenger journeys. And at those locations, we deploy additional resources. From the start of entrance into the British Transport Police, all of our officers are trained to identify the signs of hate crime. We are working with partners extensively to try and improve particularly our accessibility. And despite the fact that there are a number of means to contact us, we do recognise that there is likely to be significant underreporting, particularly in relation to disability crime, which we know has got extremely low numbers, considering the number of those with a disability that use the network. So I think there is a range of activity that is being undertaken. I think, as Barry's alluded to, that where we are identifying offenders and getting them through the court process, we have a very high success rate in terms of conviction. I think the difficulty we have collectively is the attrition before we get to a court process. So in terms of the trust and confidence of those reporting to us, it's maintaining that throughout the judicial process. So specifically for what are identified as either disability-related crimes or high-risk crimes, then those reporting persons are assigned a specific witness care officer who basically leads them through that process from start to finish. And that is to try and address the reluctance of victims to follow what can be a very lengthy process through. Inevitably, in terms of the profile of hate crime within the transport network, particularly London Underground and London Overground, predominantly racial crime features at the forefront year in, year out. A significant proportion of that is directed towards rail staff themselves, who are there as guardians of the network and will often come into conflict with individuals who are seeking to use the network or exploit it in some way. And that inevitably then results in friction, and on occasion has resulted in particularly language, probably less so physical violence being offered, that is racially motivated.
Okay, can I just pick up with you, because I understand about the attrition and the long process, but last summer I witnessed anti-Muslim hate crime on the tube, and I reported it directly to British Transport Police. I got another witness as well, and so on. And the initial response was absolutely fantastic. Couldn't fault it at all. Really quick response, really good support for myself and my friend who was the victim. I'm pleased. I'd taken a photo. Everything was going really well. I thought, we're going to get a prosecution here. I've witnessed something. It's terrible. But then the process beyond that to get a statement and so on was painfully slow. And it wasn't the dedication of your officers. It's the fact that you didn't seem to me to have enough officers who were able to take the statements and to pursue this. And nothing has now happened as a result. Do you actually have the resources, given you've got this fantastic publicity campaign and you really want to tackle this, have you got the resources to be able to deal with this and then hopefully see it to the rightful conclusion?
Well, I mean, it's always nice to have more resources, clearly, but I think we have sufficient resources to police the network effectively. I'm sorry that you've experienced the service levels you have. I think it's fair to say that we do have a relatively inexperienced workforce in some regards, so on occasion they may need help in terms of conducting what can be quite complex investigations, and indeed ensure that we are taking statements of a quality and putting case files together of a quality that are likely to result in a successful conviction. So I can't speak specifically on the example you've given. I can only apologise for that. But we do have sufficient resources. They are well trained, and clearly this is a focus for us. We recognise that the use of the transport system is multidimensional, and we do put victim care at the heart of what we do.
And your own data shows that about 53% of all hate crime cases are closed because the suspect cannot be identified. So what are you doing to try to reduce the number of cases closed because of this reason and improve the identification of suspects?
Yeah, so the identification of suspects is always a complex issue, and that's largely due to the volume of passengers that do use the network, and indeed the standard and positioning of cameras, which is primarily one of the key sources of identification procedures for us. Similarly, the timing of reports, inevitably we will receive a number of late reports, which always makes that more difficult. There are, however, across the network, and I'm talking across 3 countries, 156,000 CCTV cameras, and we do use those to good effect. We are exploring technology solutions to enable us to search that footprint more quickly. And I guess the key issue is being able to narrow the time focus of that search and getting quick access to that material. Historically, we've relied on a pretty old-fashioned process of obtaining discs. I'm pleased to say that 86% of operators have now moved to an online sort of storage and access facility, which has accelerated that process and does mean that we can improve our detection rate where identification is an issue.
That sounds really promising. And then finally from me, the data that you provided also shows clear hotspots in terms of stations and interchanges where most hate crime is taking place. Clearly Stratford, King's Cross, London Bridge, Waterloo, I think are amongst, not surprisingly, amongst others there. What specific work are BTP doing to curb hate crime at these hotspots?
So using the data analysis, effectively targeting our resources at key times and locations based on the data we have available to us, and then running, particularly with a victim focus, days of activity where we are seeking to encourage greater levels of reporting. Because inevitably, as you will have seen from the data, it tends to focus from a sort of Thursday into the weekend, generally late night into the evening. Alcohol is not unusually a factor in that, but having the right resources at the locations enable us to, I guess, curtail that activity. But crucially, I think explaining to victims how they report to us in a timely way enables us to be more responsive to those reports.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Morning. Thank you, Chair. I'll turn my mic on. Thank you, Chair. I think we've had some terrible examples this morning of people just going about their normal business and being attacked for reasons that are entirely appalling. And I think there's an enormous amount of public support for the work that we're doing and the problems that we're trying to tackle. I'd like to bring up an issue that I think may put that public support at risk. If I put my question to Commander Dales, if I may. This is about non-crime hate incidents. There was obviously a recent court case, the Miller court case. Just looking at the judgment here, in her judgment, Dame Victoria Sharp said that the net for non-crime hate speech is an exceptionally wide one, which is designed to capture speech which is perceived to be motivated by hostility, regardless of whether there is evidence that the speech is motivated by such hostility. And she went on to say that there is nothing in the guidance, this is the guidance used by police, about excluding irrational complaints, including those where there is no evidence of hostility, and little, if anything, to address the chilling effect which this may have on the legitimate exercise of freedom of expression. And so I wondered how, my concern is that we're seeing a number of these cases where people have had, there have been non-crime hate incidents recorded for issues that I think seem to a lot of people quite odd, frivolous, I think in the word of the judge. How does the Met Police approach that problem of making sure that where people are reporting incidents, there is a victim focus, but equally where a report may turn out to be frivolous or vexatious or even malicious, that's not causing either a problem for that individual person or a sort of wider public problem of losing public support for the important work?
Just checking you can hear me. Yeah. So we're very much guided by the College of Policing, who give us our guidance and have defined the definitions. And as you know, this case has just become out recently, and it has caused a lot of reconsideration from the College of Policing. So currently, the way that the Metropolitan Police works is we adhere to the guidance. And if there is a non-crime hate incident, we will report it and we will record it as such, the guidance is. What I can tell you is there was a meeting on the 21st of December, and the College of Policing met with the National Policing Chiefs Lead to discuss it. And they are currently taking legal advice, and we are due to get some new draft guidance out by the end of January, and the Metropolitan Police will then comply with that.
Okay, because my understanding, it was actually last year, I think the Home Secretary asked the College of Policing to review the recording of non-crime hate incidents. So the progress to date is that that's being worked on, and there'll be new guidance at the end of this month.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay, and in terms of accusations, as the judge has highlighted, that may be either trivial or may even, as I say, be malicious, what opportunity is there for someone who has had one of those accusations made against them to challenge that? Because obviously although these are not prosecuted, it would come up, for example, in an enhanced CRB check, which can have serious implications for someone if it relates to an incident that's either incorrectly reported or maybe didn't even happen. So what opportunity is there, what process is there for someone to challenge that?
Well, they can write in and they could appeal it in relation to the grounds and provide further evidence. But we deal with these incidents like we do any report of crime, in that the complainant reports it to us and we will record it as it is reported, and then we will investigate it. The difficulty is with this situation, which is why I welcome the new guidance personally, is that because it's not a hate crime, it's an incident, it's not always investigated in the same way or looked at. It's just a record of what's occurred, which enables us to use it for such things as our problem profile, as I spoke about earlier on. So there is an opportunity to write into us and to ask, but my understanding is at the moment is that the guidance is that we wouldn't remove it, and I think that is likely to change when we get the new guidance in January. Okay,
I mean, the logic of recording it makes a lot of sense, because if you look at crimes such as, say, harassment, it actually might be a pattern of, relatively low-level non-criminal behaviour that builds up that picture of harassment, or that might indicate, escalating problem behaviour from a particular offender. So I think I have to say, I have reservations about whether the police should be forced to delete those records. I think my concern is about the fact that, those records that the police might have then turn up in a, for example, an enhanced CRB check, where there hasn't really been a sort of judicial process to verify whether that's accurate. Do you think, I mean, is that still a problem? Is that likely to still be a problem with the new guidance?
I couldn't tell you, I've not been cited on it, and I didn't attend the meeting, but it's certainly something we can update on once the guidance comes out.
Okay, and I think I suppose my final question then on this is that, so the Miller case was about a sort of political argument about women's rights versus trans rights, which is, I think we're all aware, is currently a very contentious political issue. And it seems to me, as someone who's watched this debate, that there are probably things said by people on both sides of that discussion which could be perceived by the other side of the discussion as motivated by hate. What position does it leave the police in if people were, maybe not even vexatiously, but just honestly reporting these incidents on both sides, and then the police sort of gets drawn into this kind of political row? How does the police kind of approach that sort of problem?
Well, I mean, we obviously have to stay out of politics, as you know, And so we work very much on what is reported to us at the time, and whether or not it hits the threshold of a crime or whether or not it hits the threshold of an incident. And it is very difficult because you're talking about some cases where it is the incident which then leads to the pattern of events, like you said, which creates the crime, which is why it's been, some would argue, useful to have those incidents recorded. But it is a very, very fine line that we're treading. And with this ruling, which talks about the freedom of speech, and it's not, you know, it's not an offence to be offensive, that actually makes it even more difficult for officers to apply at the moment. So I think that's why they're pushing through the guidance so quickly and getting that legal advice to give us the clarity that we need to take this forward effectively.
Okay, and on that advice, sorry, just to come back to your answer before. So although you're, am I right in thinking you're sort of leading for hate crime within the Met, you're not directly involved in reviewing that guidance. It's the College of Policing that's doing that nationally, and effectively the Met just is left to accept whatever new guidance they propose. Is that the situation?
So within the Chief Officer portfolio across England and Wales, there will be a designated lead for chief officers at my level who will represent all the forces. They will hold what's called working groups and will have representatives from each force in relation to the ongoing work that's taken on nationally, but they will make the ultimate decision around it. A representative from London was at the meeting on the 21st of January. It wasn't me, it was one of my officers. But ultimately that work is now progressing with that NPCC lead, the legal advice from the college, and it is them who will then give us the guidance, which will then become national guidance, which we will adhere to.
Okay, I mean, I see the logic in there being national guidance, in that it sort of avoids a postcode lottery problem, and particularly, I suppose, with some of it being online, where, you know, it becomes a cross-jurisdiction problem. But I'm just looking ahead, and I'm thinking that this creates the problem that here in London, we don't have a route really to hold this guidance accountable. Because if we ask the Met Police questions, or perhaps I don't know whether MOPAC have a view, we could ask MOPAC questions. In effect, your answer is always going to be, this is the advice from the College of Policing, and we have no way of challenging it or changing it or deviating from it. Is that right?
Well, no, because we do. Because if I, as the lead for London, felt there was an issue with the guidance, I would then go back into the national lead, and I would then liaise with them and work with them to influence the change. As we're currently doing issues such as in the Vorg sector around the way that we manage and deal with rape and the guidance in relation to that. So it's not something that's set for us, it's something that's set with us, but we need a designated lead, and we do need to provide a consistent service across the United Kingdom.
Okay, so potentially we can come back to you. So obviously none of us knows yet what this new guidance will be. We can come back to you at the end of January or after the end of January to raise those issues. The chair is looking at me, so I will thank you for your time and your answers. Thank you.
Yes, we've got one more question on this. If I can ask colleagues and guests to be as concise as possible, please. Assembly Member Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Chair, and my apologies for the various layers of tech issues I've had this morning. I'd just like to go back to the really important issue of disability hate crime, and my question is to Louise and to Jennifer. We've just heard from the CPS about how the low levels of conviction for disability hate crime does affect reporting, and a suggestion of how promoting those convictions when they happen can encourage reporting. What I'd like to ask you both is, given that according to MENCAP, 97% of disability hate crimes go unreported, what type of work could the Mayor be taking to help increase reporting and to remove barriers for the reporting of hate crimes for disabled victims across London?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, great question. So we have been working with MOPAC and Gallup, who lead on the Catch Partnership. There are 3 deaf and disabled people's organisations that are involved in the Catch Partnership. They are getting increased referrals, and they've now got waiting lists. What I've been suggesting to MOPAC is that we look a little bit more strategically at how funding is allocated. One of the main barriers is that a lot of disabled people don't realise that what they're experiencing is a crime. So there needs to be more awareness raising within the communities to encourage reporting. So our suggestion is working with MOPAC and Catch and looking at the small grants fund that MOPAC offer to develop more community-based projects where they're working directly with disabled people to raise that awareness within the community and then offer them support to report. And one of the great things about deaf and disabled people's organisations is they also offer holistic services that help people to recover. So that would be my main ask.
Thank you. Jennifer. Jennifer, you're muted.
Jennifer, can you unmute your telephone?
Yeah, I would
Lovely.
like to see more work on for people with learning difficulties, how to be safe in the community when there's crime going on, and when this happens, yeah, they should report to the police, yeah, and make them understand where they're coming from and listen to them, yeah. So I would like to see that happening, yeah, when crime does happen for us, you know, because like I said before, I would like to see more police on the street for people with learning difficulties when they get into trouble, you know, and let them be safe, you know. So that's what I would like to see more happening and keep us safe in the community.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, we are horribly late, as you know I'm going to be saying. We've got less than an hour left, and we're only now going into section 2. So I'll hand now over to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of my questions have already been answered. Can I start with Mr. Kenny Bowie? How successful do you think the Mayor has been in preventing and tackling hate crime in London, and what more should he do?
So I think overall the Mayor, since he has come in, has been successful in trying to tackle and prevent hate crime. As we've already said, it's particularly and will, I am guessing, become of increasing complexity as we move forward, as more and more of this will take place online potentially. There will be a grey area between what's sort of online and in the real world, which will become increasingly blurred. I suspect much of it may be committed or not by bots overseas, etc. So I think it's a very difficult picture. When we have seen issues of hate crime spike, whether that was post the EU referendum, whether that's been during the pandemic, whether it was the recent conflict last year, Israel and Gaza, the Mayor has taken swift action to deal with it. We have seen an increase in reporting in hate crime. As the ONS report from last year makes clear, a lot of that is down to better recording on behalf of the Metropolitan Police and better identification of the fact that it is a hate crime, as well as increased confidence to come forward. Whether that can be directly attributed to the level of focus or not that the Mayor has had on it, I wouldn't want to say, but I can say that I am sure that the focus that the Mayor has had on that will have had an impact on how this is viewed within London and by the Metropolitan Police and the priority it's given. And within the current PCP, obviously hate crime is one of the main areas that is highlighted. We will be continuing with the London Crime Prevention Fund to ensure that there is hate action taken in every individual borough across London. We have the Shared Endeavour Fund, where some of the partners, CST for example, are here, and Dave has already talked about some of the good work which is done there, not just within individual boroughs but across boroughs and in the online space. We have worked with the CST on how we keep faith leaders and ensure their personal safety where we know that they often come under attack. We have worked with people across London to lobby the government to increase the places of worship fund, where that's been successful and they have increased funding. We've worked with them people to make sure that they get the funding that is needed. The Mayor has set up CATCH, the Community Coalition to Combat Hate. So I would say I think the Mayor's action in this space has been very good and will continue to be going forward.
Okay, I don't think you answered really the second part, but I'll just put in again on the first part. I mean, the figures don't really support what you're saying in when you claim that it's been successful. We've seen that the sanction detection rates are ridiculously low, and certainly in certain areas, and also and I don't want to cut across what anyone else is going to be asking later, but if you look at the stats in relation to crimes per thousand, the figures are still going in the wrong direction, so I'm not quite sure how that can be deemed to be a success. But I also did ask, and this is what I'm more interested in getting an answer to, what more should he be doing? What more should he do, in your opinion? What more should the Mayor, or could the Mayor do to help prevent hate crime?
So I think you're talking about police recorded crime, where I would suggest that actually the figures going up would suggest that the figures are going in the right direction. If you actually look at the gap between police recorded crime and what is meant to be the overall prevalence of crime as measured by the CSCW, that would appear to have closed, although the next survey will only come out in 2023, and as part of the what more we should be doing and what more we actually will be doing, as witnessed by the draft policing crime plan, is we will be doing a public attitude survey which actually includes victimisation.
Sorry, I don't want to cut across you, but I'm asking what the Mayor should do.
And that's the question I'm now responding to, Assembly Member. So in the draft policing crime plan, what we have said that the Mayor will do is to increase the public attitude survey, which will go from a 12,000 to roughly to about 18,000, and will include victimisation for the first time, which means that we will get a proper view for the first time of what the prevalence of hate crime within London is, because as other guests here today have said, at the moment actually there's a difference between what is police recorded crime and what is the actual prevalence of that. That will give not only us but the Metropolitan Police a much better intelligence base upon which to base their activity, including all of their new, for example, hate crime liaison officers. It will allow the stakeholder reference group to be much better done, and it will allow us to focus our funding in a much more targeted way. So I think that getting the proper evidence base of prevalence and understanding exactly what sort of crime types there are is one of the key things. I think one of the other things which the Mayor can and will be doing is lobbying for the government in terms of the online harms bill, making sure that that is brought in a sensible way, and that the government is taking action on a national and international level to deal with a lot of the harms and the hate that you actually see online, where that must be dealt with at that sort of level, because in the same way as something with fraud, which I highlighted at the meeting before Christmas, it's something which breaks the traditional offender-victim location triangle, and where it requires a sort of nationally coordinated response. So I think those are the things that I would highlight that the Mayor could and will be doing.
So there's one thing that he will be taking action on, and then there's something he'll be asking the government to do. They're the two things. Interesting.
Well, there are two things I highlighted.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, the next question I'm going to ask has been partially asked by Marina Ahmed already, but I can ask it of Dave Rich. Dave, what are the main barriers to someone coming forward to address a hate crime, in your opinion?
The most common reasons when certainly people in the Jewish community are asked why they don't report hate crime, the most common reason given is that they lack confidence that anything will be done, or that it seems like more trouble than it's worth to go through the process of reporting. Now, I don't think that is specific to the Jewish community when it comes to hate crime, and I suspect that is not specific to hate crime either. That's probably the case with lots of types of crime. And therefore, our response to that, obviously, is to try and boost confidence that action will be taken. I think that's where I come back to my previous point of the importance of prosecutions happening and being seen to happen by the community. to boost that confidence that it is worth spending the time reporting. And we also play a role in trying to help people report and ease their path through the criminal justice process. And I think that's where the Catch programme has been very helpful in ensuring that hate crime victims, when they do report, have that support from within their own communities.
Okay. Do you think it's useful coming from you, obviously, Assembly Member Ahmed asked the disability people, but is there anything specifically you think would be more helpful, or are there maybe, I mean, you mentioned Catch, which is a good thing, but I mean, I've known people who've been victims of crime or hate crime, and as you say, they just don't see the point in making the complaint. What do you think? Is there anything that either the Met or organisations like yourselves could do to help people to come forward more?
I think it's about publicity to persuade people that it is worth reporting, but then we have to make it worth reporting. Mm-hmm. And I think that means the investigations have to be solid investigations. The initial response from the police when hate crimes are reported to them has to be a good response. There's no point persuading people to report if they're going to have a bad experience.
Yeah.
So it's all part of the same picture.
Okay. All right, so just quickly, if I can come back to Kenny Bowie, do you think there's something the Mayor could do then? Maybe increase publicity on the benefits of reporting a crime, and perhaps even publicising how successful sanction detection rates are and how successful the police have been in prosecutions, to make it, to encourage people to come forward? Is that, I think, something the Mayor should be doing?
I think the Mayor's, as I highlighted earlier, doing a lot around combating hate in terms of, if you look at the campaigns on TFL that are ongoing at the moment. Is there always more that could be done? Arguably, yes, there always will be. Sanction detection rates, I'm sure you'll have noticed on the draft policing crime plan, one of the areas where we intend to look and have a focus and display to the public visibly what are the sanction detection rates. That is an area, hate crime is one of the areas that is listed in that, and certainly going forward, publicity around areas or how we communicate is always important, and will continue being so to the Mayor. If people have good suggestions about how we should be doing that in a different or more proactive way, we are always happy to consider them.
All right, thanks, that's very helpful. Moving on then, we're out of time. This is to the Met and MOPAC. Perhaps I'll start with MOPAC. Sorry, no, I won't ask MOPAC. Yeah, the Met and BTP, I think, actually, probably better. Start with the Met. What actions are the Met taking to break down the barriers and support more victims of hate crime to come forward?
That's the work that's being driven by beneath that. There is a link through to the stakeholder group, which is where the independent advisory members sit, which is a meeting that's chaired by MOPAC and linked straight through for us. So we work with that advisory group and members of the strategic group and the working groups that sit underneath it to understand what the barriers are, and then are trying to remove them. Now, it's quite in its early stages. The very first thing that we have been doing is trying to identify the problem in London, which is in relation to where the problem profile came in, which gave us our hotspots and told us where our issues were. But the work of the board and the working groups will be to identify, understand, remove the barriers, and that's why it's the strategic aim of the group.
Okay. So if I can ask BTP, are you on that panel? Or that board, or whatever they call it?
No.
Well, that might be a good idea, mightn't it? Have you got any comments on the question about what are you doing to break down the barriers, please?
So I think we do work with the Met, TFL and a range of other partners, and indeed forces nationally to engage with resident communities. Obviously, we don't ourselves have a resident community. We do conduct various surveys of our own passenger users, which includes those that would be potential victims of hate crime. And as I said earlier, specifically for victims that are identified as having a disability or fear and distress received an enhanced service by the allocation of a witness and care officer to lead them through the process. I think that, as Dave has said earlier on, I think the key issue here is that communities must see that justice is being done, but I don't think we can police our way out of it. I think this is more about preventing it in the first place, making it societally unacceptable, that sort of behaviour won't be tolerated. And indeed, partners such as TfL do exclude people from the network where we identify those that are repeat offenders, largely because no one should be exposed to that sort of behaviour when they're using a public service.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Very good. Final question then to Kenny Bowie again. What has been the impact of the work MOPAC and the Victims Commissioner for London undertook with the Met and BTP to identify reasons why hate crimes withdraw from the criminal justice process?
What has been the impact of it?
Do you want me to repeat it slowly? Yeah, you've got...
I'm slightly struggling to hear you,
no,
sorry.
it's not, no, it's you, it's me, don't worry. I'm going to pop at you. You've got MOPAC and you've got something called the Victims Commissioner for London, and apparently you undertook with the Met and BTP an exercise to identify the reasons why hate crime victims withdraw from the criminal justice process. I just wonder what the outcome of that work was, or has it not happened?
So I'll need to write to you about that.
Right, thank you. All right, great, thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll add that to the things that we need to hear about. Assemblymember Desai. And Michelle, your microphone.
Sorry, Chair, I said, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and I will try to be as brief as possible, but there are 3 or 4 questions I must put to the panel. So if I could ask you, Mr. Bowie, you've already been asked about preventing and tackling hate crime in London, but in terms of prevention, can I specifically ask you about behavioral patterns? What work is MOPAC doing to address the behavior of hate crime offenders and the causes of hate crime?
So we have the Shared Endeavour Fund, which has been 1.4 million over the last 2 years, where we are actively engaged in cross-borough activity to change the attitudes and behaviours of people in relation to that. We're working with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue there to ensure that we get independent evaluation of that we understand what works in respect of the activity that we undertake, and that we're then able to make sure that we use the theory of change that we have, that we update that, and that we're able to publicise and share that with all the participants so that we have an evidence base within which to do that. We will also work, well, this is more for the Met, probation and others, but where clearly people have been violent offenders and there's a hate element, there is integrated defender management, there is all of the MAPA, there are a lot of the other activities which are done there, where we will continue to play an active oversight role in all of this. We have the, as I said earlier, the London Crime Prevention Fund, which will ensure that there's anti-hate activity undertaken in each borough at a particularly local level, where they'll be able to use their own intelligence and insights to make sure that they are challenging the sort of the behaviours and the attitudes which lead to those behaviours. We have, I mean, this isn't in the offender space, but we have work, as I said earlier, working with faith leaders and others working in those groups to make sure that they know that they keep themselves safe, and other work such as that.
Okay. If I could ask you, Mr. Rich, the Community Security Trust, and I'm a big fan of your work, by the way.
Thank you.
But just as a case study, what sort of educational work do you do? And also in terms of reaching out to other communities. I do know you do a lot of outreach work because I follow you on social media.
So I mentioned earlier the project we run called Stand Up, which is supported by the Shared Endeavour Fund, actually, which sends young educators into schools to educate about anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, and discrimination more generally. And we use that proactively, but we also use it as a tool to respond to incidents that have happened in schools. And generally speaking, it's had a very positive impact in those schools where we've worked. And then more broadly, in wider communities, we have, as I mentioned earlier, our SAFE program, which uses our kind of expertise in learning on hate crime and community security and other issues to share that with people from other communities, which obviously has a specific learning on hate crime, but is more generally a way of contributing to the building of partnerships and relationships between different communities in London and in the UK as a whole.
So, I mean, now is not the time, Chair, to explore that in more detail, but I think this is something maybe we can liaise with MOPAC as to how we actually have programs actually broaden understanding of hate as it affects all sections. There is a commonality to all to sort of all types of
just
different
to add,
types of hate.
MOPAC has been very helpful in supporting the SAFE program and helping to bring people together.
Yeah, and that's what we want to know, examples of good practice as well. We're not just here to criticize. So 2 more questions, Chair. And perhaps I should ask this to the Met and BTP and MOPAC, although others may wish to come in, because I'm conscious of the time. It's a question to do with sports and the role of sports in our society. So as the Mayor has recently spoken about, sports can play a hugely positive role in addressing all kinds of issues. Sadly, there were and are instances of hatred and intolerance highlighted within professional sport. And as a result of this, as a result of professional sport last year, whilst the Mayor's Sports Unites program states it seeks to strengthen connections within communities, do you feel that there is more work that could be done across sporting life in London, both within professional clubs and at a grassroots level, to address hate crime? I mean, do you want to start off, Mr. Bowie?
Yeah, absolutely, very, very happy to. So I think two of the groups within the Shared Endeavour Fund, for example, that we work with is West Ham and Chelsea. So there obviously is some good work being done there. Would we like to see a stronger stance on this, not just in football, but from everybody across the board? Yes, we absolutely would. Is sport a great way, though, of bringing diverse and different communities together and trying to build tolerance? As the Mayor has said, it absolutely is, and it's something we would like to see more of.
Do you wish to come in? Deputy Commander, Assistant Chief Constable Dahl.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, clearly, anything more we can do would be helpful. I think that the work we've done is, in terms of We Stand Together, the work that we've worked with on TFL in terms of standing together against hate, I think we will solve this if we do it as a community, as a whole community. I don't think that there is only one section that we ought to resolve this. And as I said earlier, that it should be unacceptable for anybody to experience hate crime wherever they are, particularly on the transport network, and indeed for those that see that to call it out, as Caroline referred to earlier on.
Commander Dills? Is Commander Dills still with us?
Thank you. I am. It just takes me a while to unmute, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, from a policing point of view in London, we're very much aware of the spike that we get in reports in relation to particularly football matches. So we have been working with our public order commanders to ensure that we do have a bespoke response to hate crime in relation to sporting events across London, and that we manage it in a really proactive way. Surprisingly, actually, the majority of hate crime offences actually occur towards police officers trying to police the match if they are from a diverse background. So we've been working to support not only external members of the public in relation to sporting events, but the impact on our policing officers as well.
I do want to continue with football theme in terms of my last question, but do any of the other panelists wish to come in? Because this is about inclusion in sports. If any of the other panelists have got any thoughts, or you may wish to write to us.
Could I come in on this, please?
Sorry,
yes,
who's
of
that?
course.
Just briefly.
Oh, sorry, of course, yeah.
Hello. Yeah, just from a CPS perspective, this is an area, hate crime in sport, and especially in the Premier League, which it's very attention-grabbing, and so it's a great way to promote how well we can deal with hate crime. So refer back to what I was saying before about publicity helping individuals to feel confident to report crimes. And we have, over the last 6 months, embarked on a programme of engaging with Premier League clubs, 2 in particular, where we have really good contacts, and we've had prosecutors go out to train members of staff at a senior and very senior level about what hate crime is, what we can prosecute, what we can't prosecute, and the steps that we can take to raise the number of offences that can be brought to court and secure justice in a public forum. It's gone really well so far. We've had a great response from the Premier League. We've just before Christmas been in touch with the head of safeguarding for the Premier League, and this is a programme which we intend to roll out further across London next year. But just because it is an aspect of hate crime that has such a high profile, we regard this as a really good opportunity to promote across the criminal justice system how well we can deal with hate crime.
Thank you. If you can just move on to my final question then, Chair. So just on the football team, and this is to Commander Dales. So early last year, was it last? In fact, it was last year. Yeah, early last year, the West Midlands Police introduced the force's first football hate crime officer to deal with abuse in the region associated with the sport. Have you liaised with colleagues in the West Midlands about this work? Do you think that it is something that could be replicated here in London?
I answered that in my last question, and that's exactly what we've done. We have got designated within the Public Order Command for management of football and sport.
You're learning from the West Midlands, but can I just ask, what's your relationship with social media companies? Because I understand in the West Midlands, it took the police to get, it took them 6 months to get a response from Twitter to a simple data request.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
Well, the West Midlands Police put a request into Twitter, a data request, and took Twitter nearly 6 months to respond. I mean, what's your relationship with social media companies? Because that's what a lot of the abuse sort of goes on.
Yeah, I'm not. To be honest, I don't have the detail in relation. I don't have any knowledge of any issue in London in relation to that. So I've not briefed on any issues that I can inform you on, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, perhaps we can formulate a question around that we can get an answer to. Assembly member decide. Thank you. Well, are you happy now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we're now moving on to our third section, which is supporting victims of hate crime. Some of these answers will have been touched on, so if I can ask guests to be mindful of that, and also our colleagues, Assembly members. Going to start with, over to Assembly member McCartney.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I was going to say the same thing. I think some of these questions have in part been answered. But my first question is to MOPAC, if I can, and that is that I'm aware that there is a London Hate Crime Board, which is chaired by the Victims Commissioner. And I know it undertook work during 2019 and 20, looking at hate crime trends, and there was a forum where members could share concerns. Can I just ask, what were the outcomes and findings of that work, and what action did MOPAC take in relation to those findings?
So the findings will have fed into the drafting of the policing crime plan, and as the evidence base for all of that. It will also have helped inform the fact that we reviewed our overall governance and brought together with the MPS, the stakeholder reference group. We now have Catch to help support victims as well, which is a 2-year contract running this year and next. And if it's okay, I will write with any further specifics which I can get from my team once following this.
That'd be very helpful. I think some of those key findings and what action you took would be really useful for us. I have another question for MOPAC, if I can, and that's, how successful was the establishment of a COVID community forum that tried to provide reassurance to and support to the Chinese community as the pandemic spread? I know we have had some discussion of this a little earlier, but my other question is, does that forum still exist, and what lessons did you learn that can be applied to other categories of victims?
So I don't think the COVID community group still exists. Whether it was a success, I mean, you're slightly asking me to mark my own homework in that regard. So I'm likely to say yes, it was a success. Why do I think that? Because I think that the model in terms of allowing us to have quick outreach to certain community groups to hear the issues that they raise directly, and then to be able to think about how that informs not just the MOPAC response, but anything which we can feed into the wider GLA infrastructure for the Mayor to consider. I think those are all lessons which we can take away, including how we sort of have, I mean, obviously the biggest thing with the pandemic is how we've moved things online and how that actually in some ways allows you to reach wider, more widely, more quickly. So I think those are the things I would highlight at this point, sorry, for the benefit of brevity.
I think that'd be helpful. I think one of the things that we at the Assembly often refer to is the fact that quite often things are set up, and then when similar situations arise, there seems to be a lack of institutional memory about what has previously worked before. So I think it would be really good if that, if it was a very successful forum, you know, can be embedded somewhere so that if situations arise, that model can be applied elsewhere. But any more further information would be useful, I think, in writing. So I suppose my other question to MOPAC is really about specialist services and support. The Mayor in his draft police and crime plan has committed to that again in the future. And MOPAC obviously holds the commissioning ring on a lot of that funding. So can I just ask from MOPAC's point of view, how do you ensure that you're offering that specialist support? And I appreciate there's quite often a tension between offering a generic victim support services and how you balance that with specialists, but certain categories of crime such as this do really warrant specialist services.
So I think the way we would do this, I would highlight the community action coalition, to combat hate, the catch activity which we have funded, where there are, a number of the organisations here are all part of that, where we are trying to ensure that we cover the full gamut of what of the people who can be affected by hate crime. Clearly, you're never going to get 100%, nothing's ever going to be perfect, but I do think the fact that this has been set up in the way it has, that it's a 2-year contract in order to give a bit of stability to the groups involved, and that it covers, for example, disability, it covers anti-Semitic, it covers LGBTQ+. So I think that in terms of that, we have done quite a lot of that, and as we go forward into the next stages, when the contract, when we look at the next PCP and consider what the contracts are involved there, as I've already highlighted, hate crime is an area which is a priority for the Mayor, and we will seek to learn the lessons of what has happened already and will happen over the next year with the catch contract.
Okay, thank you. My final question then is to those community groups who are here. Does anyone have a view about whether the action and funding from MOPAC is enough, and what more would you like to see that could improve outcomes for victims of hate crime, in particular I think around those support services? So Chair, I wonder if you could call anyone that wants to tell us about that, because I can't see individually the people that are in the room with you.
Okay, does Dr. Matteo want to comment, because he's not commented on much so far? No, I can't see him now. Louise, would you like to comment briefly?
Thank you. Yeah, I've already covered what I feel would work best for disabled victims of hate crime. I think there's an issue around prevention. We don't want people to be experiencing hate crime. There's a lot more work that could be done around that. We have particularly been looking at the number of disabled people that end up in the criminal justice system as well. and get involved in county lines. And there's something that could be done around that. But other than what I've already said, I don't want to take up any time. Thank you.
Chair, I wonder,
Thank you.
could I come in?
Who's that? Oh, yes, absolutely. If you can be brief, though.
I will be brief. It's just a broader point which I've wanted to try and get in over the course of the last half hour or so, and it's this. Nobody wants to be a victim, and especially nobody wants to be a victim of hate crime because it goes to their personal characteristics. But also, apart from us lawyers, nobody really wants to go to court. And so it seems to me that it's important that if we are having victims giving evidence in court, we should make that experience as painless as possible. And it is possible to make it less painful through the use of technology. And Charlie referred before to technology and the way in which it can help us investigate and prosecute people. And the expansion in CCTV and body-worn video footage has been a tremendous tool for investigators and prosecutors. And we can now take cases to court which, frankly, I wouldn't have been able to prosecute 20 years ago at all, let alone do so successfully. And this use of technology brings a cost as well, but it also has huge advantages. And we can run cases now without victims having to go through that experience of giving evidence in court. Legislation to enable people to give their evidence in chief through a pre-recording, and now, as of September last year, now 2021, to be able to give for qualifying victims their evidence under cross-examination without having to go into a public courtroom is, in my view, a tremendous step forward. We're only in the foothills, but it has the potential to make the victim's experience at court significantly less difficult. And I just thought I'd like to make that point because it's, for me, it's particularly relevant in the context of hate crime and the way that that attacks an individual's personal characteristics.
That certainly was a very, very interesting contribution. Thank you. If anybody really wants to speak, then just wave at me here on the room and I'll certainly bring you in. I'm glad you didn't miss that part. Dave Rich, then very, very briefly on Assembly Member.
Sure. Two things that I think would really aid victims' experience would be the speed of an investigation, obviously the quicker the better, and better communication about the progress of an investigation. I think victims can go far too long without really hearing anything from police or CPS about how an investigation is going.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. We're now going to move on to Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. I will be brief as well, and good afternoon, everybody. Kenny, my question is to you in the MOPAC. Who is delivering MOPAC's new specialist support service for hate crime victims, please? And is it up and running yet?
That is the catch work which we have been talking about, which is delivered by a number of the organisations around this table, both physically and virtually. Today it is up and running and the contract lasts, as I understand it, until the end of the next financial year.
Great. And how will this new service differ from and enhance the services previously funded by MOPAC? And what will this mean for the victims of hate crime in London? And you can be very, very brief on the latter.
Hopefully it will mean at its most basic, hopefully it will mean that they get a better service. The reason that it's different is that it's a coalition of different groups who each bring their own specialisation and each bring a much greater knowledge of their own community than one generic provider. So it's an attempt to bridge what is a sort of London-wide approach with something which brings together the sort of more specialist organisations.
Thank you. Maybe you could write to the committee specifically on the differences between the previous one and this one in a bit more detail, please. Moving on, this is to anybody who wants to comment, but I'm going to particularly ask Dave Rich first and then Louise Holden this question. Anybody else, please shout if I don't catch your eye on Zoom. Question is, do you believe that the repeat victimisation of hate crime victims is properly recognised? I think that may have already been answered, but the specific of the question I really want to be answered rather is, and that the levels of repeat victimisation are measured accurately. So, Dave.
I know we do, but I couldn't answer on behalf of the Met about whether their processes for measuring repeat victims.
Thank you. Louise?
Hi, thank you. I think in terms of hate crime against disabled people, it often starts off as low-level, non-criminal, so antisocial behaviour. And there is a really exciting initiative by the Met. There was a small team of, I think, 6 officers that were looking at some technology. So when an officer attends a call out, they can use this technology to coordinate lots of different information. And we were told that traditionally they would go back to the office, it would take them 2 hours to sort of do the research, and quite often patterns were missed. And we would really like to see more development of this technology. We were told that the HCOPs, which now lead on the hate crime for the Met, were going to be trained up in this technology to disseminate that to frontline officers. And we would like to see, we'd like to know if that's happened and if that's something that can be taken forward by the Met, because we believe that that will greatly improve recognising hate crime against disabled people, because it quite often starts off as antisocial behaviour and it won't get on their system as a crime. But if they can link to that information, they're more likely to see that pattern and the repeat incidents that have happened to that victim, and also repeat offenders. So yeah, that's what I'd like to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Commander Dales could answer that, or maybe write to us if she hasn't got an answer.
Yeah, I'll write to you about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Lovely, thank you very much. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask MOPAC about the online hate crime hub that the Mayor launched back in 2017. Is that still operational, and what impact has it had on supporting victims of hate crime?
So I believe the online hate crime hub was then taken up at a national level by the government. I think I'm right in saying that it's based out of GMP, and it provides basically a triage service where it directs cases to the most relevant force for investigation. As to the impact on victims of that, if I'm correct, and it is a government-led or a government-funded scheme now, then I think we would have to direct the question to them for that.
Okay, well, we'll look into that, see if there's any analysis. Thank you for that update. And then I wanted to ask about, maybe I could ask Dave this, and thank you for coming today. Your contribution, as always, has been hugely valuable. What is the Met's approach, in your view, supporting victims of hate crime effective? And what more should it be doing? And that could also apply for the other police forces we have in London City and also BTP.
I think the partnership between the Met and community organisations certainly within the Catch programme, and therefore with MOPAC as well, is an effective partnership. We get regular referrals of people who've reported hate crime to the police, who then get referred through the Catch programme for specific tailored support and advocacy. And I think that programme works well. Obviously, for people who fall outside of that programme, I don't have experience of that, and but it may be that their experience is not to the same level. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. And do you think there's more coordination needed between the different forces in London, the Met, BTP and City of London Police?
There's always benefit from more coordination, and I would also say even within the Met, sometimes if there's different linked offences in different BCUs, they don't always get connected to each other in the way you would hope. And that's a role we always try to play. And also where offences, where there's a pattern of offences with London-based forces and also forces immediately outside of London, again, that's a pattern we try and play to make sure everyone's joined up. So, again, I'm not aware of cases we're not involved in, and whether that joining up actually happens, I don't know.
Lovely. No, that's really helpful, that thought between bits of the Met as well, not just the different forces. That's very helpful. I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now over to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Again, I think one of my questions have been asked, so I'll just ask the one question, which is of the Met. There. In your 21-24 business plan, it reported that you would establish a virtual hate crime hub, recruit and train hate crime outcomes and performance officers, and establish a hate crime strategic board to provide pan-London consistency and quality of service. What progress has been made on those commitments?
So the board is the one that I chair, that I spoke about in the first question that I answered. Sits bi-monthly. It's got a good, strong membership. It's supported by the stakeholder IAG group and a number of working groups. The HCOPs exist. They are currently on each of the BCUs, and they're supported by the Hate Crime Virtual Hub, which sits in our Continuous Policing Improvement Command, which oversees and supervises those officers to get consistency.
And do you think it would benefit from having the BTP there, seeing as a lot of the crime occurs on TfL property, which of course is some of it is manned by the BTP?
No, I don't think it would. Charlie and I work closely together on projects that we need to. We've got a mental health work stream at the moment that's ongoing where it crosses. But in terms of hate crime, the importance is identifying trends that happen at an operational level in relation to where we get an offender committing an offence on the BTP networks, TfL networks, or with us. That's an operational issue which wouldn't be impacted by the strategic work that I do. That operational work is already ongoing by the analysts and the intelligence that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moema has got a brief question on this, and then would you take us straight into misogyny, Assembly Member Moema? We have less than 15 minutes to the end of the session. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. Just to take us back slightly to Assembly Member McCartney's question, I'm also really conscious that we haven't touched on anti-Black racism and just how widespread that is in London. And so a question to the Met and the CPS really is, how do your various strategies translate into operational or kind of convictions for the CPS for Black Londoners and Asian Londoners in particular? Obviously what we do around hate crime is important, but just as we've been talking, its absence makes me wonder if that is deprioritised.
So it's certainly not deprioritised from my aspect. It's the most prevalent type of hate crime that we experience across London. So it's something that we're highly aware of and that we're working collectively to try and improve. I think your question was, how do we make it operationally impact? Yeah, that's the work of the hate crime officers. Their work is to identify the most prevalent victims within their BCU, and then to work with the partners and the officers to ensure that there's a really strong proactive investigation and to get that done within the timescales, which allow us then to take it to CPS to get the conviction. And that's the work that my colleague from CPS has reported that has been the reason why we've increased the amount of cases coming through to CPS, which is why we in turn been able to increase the prosecutions that we're doing.
Thanks, Mel. And from my perspective for the CPS, I think I said earlier that Mel's absolutely right. These cases, racist, aggravated offences, by far make up the greatest proportion of all the hate crimes that we deal with by a very big margin. They also have the highest conviction rate for all the different types of hate crime. So I think that overall we deliver a pretty good service here. When it comes to hate crime, I do think that racist and religious offending is something we do well. There are other aspects which I mentioned earlier, such as crimes against older people and disability hate crime, where I think we could do better. But I'm fairly confident that we deliver a strong service when it comes to racially aggravated offending.
Thank you. I'll take this straight on, Chair.
Thank you, that's fine.
My question again is to the Met, BTP and CPS, which is that the Home Office Minister Susan Williams announced that police forces would be asked to record crimes where hostility against women is a factor on an experimental basis, and that was last autumn. I want to know if the Met has actioned this, and if not, when are you planning to do that, given that the Law Commission has already reported?
So it was a optional request. The Met hasn't done it. We are waiting to find out the results from the Law Commission's report, which should come out and obviously have been part of the papers that I've been provided with. We are waiting to get the national steer about what we need to do, and we are looking to learn the lessons from other forces around actually what they found and how it actually contributes. What the Law Commission paper has talked about is about the fact there needs to be a specific offence in relation to misogyny and not to link it into hate crime. So we're waiting to find out what actually the result of that will be, and then obviously we will then progress that in line with the national standards.
Okay, so I'm going to try and avoid the kind of cul-de-sac of the Law Commission report, but just on that, it has been some time, and this committee has asked on a number of occasions what the Met is doing. Obviously, the response has been that we're looking at what other people have been doing. So in the interim, from last autumn until now, what have you collected data, which is London-wide? What can you tell us which you think works or doesn't work at this point, even though that's still interim, that you have learned from other forces? And you're thinking of Nottingham.
Nothing. We're still waiting for the results to come through. They've not been published nationally. So we're in a position of waiting to find out exactly what benefit it gains, exactly what impact it's had on victims, and these things don't happen. So the Met's position on this is we will not be collecting data of this nature, and we will wait until the report comes out, and we will then consider the findings.
Okay. And then, so we've had, again, at this committee, so Steve House and the Commissioner Cressida Dick talk at various points about the collection or recording, rather than what the Law Commission says, recording the sex of victims. And I just wondered if you are of the view, as the Met, similar to this committee and the whole Assembly, that there are certain things that happen. People are victims sometimes by virtue of the fact that they are women simply. And there are things which have been now criminalised, upskirting, revenge porn, and so on. And the work that the BTP is doing across the network is really, really good. But what does that translate to? I mean, surely there must be some benefit to recording, if not actioning, but to recording some of that information so that you can start to gather data without having to wait for the Law Commission. Would that not be beneficial to women Londoners?
So just because there's not a current offence and it's not listed under hate crime, there are a number of other offences that fall within that, and mainly the public order offences or the breach of the peace offences. When any officer records a crime, they will automatically record the gender of the complainant, so that information will be there. What the Met's Positions Police is that we are not taking part in a formal trial in relation to this because we're waiting to find out what the national position is, as I've said to you. It doesn't mean to say that in cases where there are offences that we're not using alternative legislation in order to gather that information that you're talking about and dealing with the offences proportionately.
So the reason I raise that is that obviously 4 women died in very public and tragic circumstances last year. And we have had subsequently, particularly post Sarah Everard's murder and the sentencing, and then Bieber and Nicole as well, we've had across London some BCUs receive additional officers, in part to provide reassurance to women. But those women, but there seems to be a disconnect between where those officers are placed and the way in which the particular needs of boroughs. So, for example, each of those women died or were killed rather on the way home whilst they're alone. Additional police officers have been deployed primarily to high footfall areas, not to places where women are walking home, going about their business, as we've talked about earlier in the case of disabled Londoners, and receiving, that catcalling, that potentially unsafe situation. I just wonder how it is going to be possible for you to meaningfully deploy officers to actually protect women if we don't have the data for where things happen, and they might be low-level things which are just cumulative in a particular location. How are you recording that, and can we get some reassurance to the committee that that is happening?
So there's an app that's been pushed out by the government in relation to identifying where low-level issues of VOG occur in public space, and that has formed part of the public space VOG strategy. I just want to check with the chair. This is actually, I know we're very short time. I'm really happy to have this conversation with you offline. I'm very conscious we're moving away from hate crime, so I'm happy to have this conversation with you, set something up, or I can carry on.
Yes, I'm happy if we do that, because this does need proper examination and we simply haven't got the time now. I'm happy to set something separate up, and I'm very grateful for you saying that you would come to that. Are you happy with that, Assembly Member Moema?
I just have just maybe a couple more questions, just because I think it's important to talk about misogyny in the context of hate crime, and not as a separate issue. And I appreciate that the Law Commission have decided not to make that an offence. However, when we're thinking about protected characteristics and what the police are doing and what we as wider Londoners can do, I do think it's important to have some of that here. But I just wondered, perhaps a question to everybody, whether you think if we were to be able to collect that information, whether within your own communities or, for example, if you're a disabled Londoner, for Jewish Londoners, whether that would be helpful in kind of improving the quality of the reports that you receive and are able to action and support people in terms of training and so on. I just wondered if that was something that might be helpful. And just really think about the intersectional nature of sex and gender, and in the context of hate crime. I just think it's a bit unfortunate that it's already quite a short section.
Well, can I ask, has anybody got anything specific about this? I am happy to bring this to another committee on this when decisions have been made. Has anybody got anything they specifically want to say on this? No?
Hi, Louise here. Sorry, just quickly, I would welcome another meeting, a committee meeting about this, specifically around disabled women and being out in the street. I know that I've known Jennifer for a long time, and out in the streets in Lambeth, it's a daily occurrence of being approached by men. I know of another colleague who looks different, and men assume she has a learning difficulty, and she is constantly propositioned. It's a definite issue for disabled women. Also, visually impaired women being inappropriately touched when under the guise of being offered help. There's so many issues that we could discuss about that.
Okay,
so I would welcome another.
Thank you. I think therefore it would warrant it. I've seen Dave's hand, and then we really have got to end this session.
Sure. All I'd say is that a lot of the anti-Semitic abuse directed at Jewish women, and particularly high-profile Jewish women online, very clearly has a misogynistic aspect to it, and I think that probably is worth capturing and should be part of that later discussion.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Are you happy to finish it there, Assembly Member Moema, and we'll certainly come back to it?
Yes, that will be fine. If we can come back to it, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I would like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for the very interesting answers to these questions. I think this session could have gone on a lot longer. And may I make a particular comment to Jennifer Taylor? Sometimes coming on these things can be very daunting, and I think you did very, very well, Jennifer, and thank you so much for joining us. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 25th of January 2022 at 10 a.m. I have no other urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you all.